Good afternoon and welcome to the September webinar for the Smart Grid Educational Series. Today we have Phil Lin, the Director of Product Marketing at FireEye, who's going to be presenting on protecting your utility in an age of next generation threats, where he's going to be discussing some of the more recent type of threats that are facing enterprises, utilities, and government organizations, and what are some ways of mitigating the risks associated with those threats. Now, FireEye is a startup company in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the founder of FireEye, Ashar Aziz, is someone that I have known for over almost 30 years. And he has been a real pioneer in the information technology field, having worked many years during the 80s and 90s at Sun Microsystems and making some very original contributions to the TCP/IP protocol. So we're very privileged to have someone from his company come and speak about an issue that is really causing a lot of headaches for the security folks in many, many organizations. And particularly with utilities now that we're moving into the regime of smart grid and internetworking the SCADA, the enterprise, the AMI, and also creating web-based applications that would allow customers to observe their energy usage and also provide demand response signals to level the peak demand so that we have better utilization of our generation resources, and also the need to do demand response to shape the renewable energy source with the demand for electricity. And this is becoming increasingly more and more important. So as these new smart grid applications are enabled, including electric vehicles, doing distribution grid management, wide area monitoring, protection, and control, using phasor measurement units, and then continuing into energy storage, and as I mentioned, AMI and demand response. What we are seeing are many new threat vectors that are coming about, and there are risks associated with those threat vectors, and it's really important for us to do a proper risk assessment and then put the appropriate technologies and business process and policies in place to mitigate the risks associated with those threats and vulnerabilities. So this talk comes at a very timely place in the smart grid development, and we're very privileged to have Phil Lin. So without any further delay, I would like Phil to start the presentation. Phil?
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Erfan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I think we've got a pretty interesting talk, I hope, for everybody. And again, if there's any kind of questions, please do send them in, and we'll try to address them either throughout the presentation or at the end. Again, my name is Phillip Lin. I'm the Director of Product Marketing over here at FireEye, and I very much appreciate this chance to introduce you to the topic and the problem, the reason that we exist at FireEye, and for us to be able to introduce a little bit about some of our thoughts on how we can better protect our critical infrastructure here in the United States. FireEye, as Erfan mentioned, is based in the Silicon Valley. We are actually been around for about 7 years now, and was invested in by In-Q-Tel, the venture arm of the U.S. intelligence community. And so we've been a close partner in terms of the public-private partnerships in helping to secure not only enterprise networks, but also our critical infrastructure network. So I'll talk a little bit more about the utilities and some of the national laboratories, anonymized, of course, that we protect and how we protect them. Let me get started here with slide number 2.
Yes. Phil, I will move the presenter ball to you, and that will allow you to move the slides. Because if you move them right now, they won't be reflecting on the audience. So let me move the ball to you, and now you should
Great.
Thanks.
Great. If you could just confirm that you're also seeing slide number 2 at this moment.
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect. All right. So when we talk a lot about these advanced targeted attacks, a lot of the buzz or the news around these types of advanced targeted attacks is the fact that they're increasing in volume. There's so many of them. But I don't think that really gets at the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue these days is that these types of advanced targeted attacks are being more effective than ever, and the nature of the threats have actually changed as well. Instead of just broadly targeting and broadly attacking a lot of folks in kind of a scattershot manner, we're really seeing these pieces of malware and keyloggers and different types of cyber weapons, for lack of a better term, being used in a very advanced and targeted manner, very persistent, thus the advanced persistent threat moniker that we put on these cyber criminals. These APTs are background actors that potentially work for nation-state operators or potentially cyber activists in of themselves. And they're producing a lot of high-profile victims. We've heard about the RSA attack, the attacks against Symantec, and even Google, just to get a source code and attack these folks who are part of that information supply chain. We hear a lot about these types of attacks, and Gartner has reaffirmed the fact that these are advanced threats that are putting our critical infrastructure at risk today. And so let me move on to the next slide. And we've seen a lot of these different types of attacks against Symantec and Google and Adobe. But the background here is that that's not really the end goal for the cyber criminals. As interested as they may be in the source code for Adobe Acrobat Reader, really what they're getting at by trying to penetrate an Adobe or get at the secure ID algorithms that RSA developed, what the cyber criminals are really after are the customers of RSA, the customers of Adobe, the users of Adobe Reader. What they're looking for in the source code are those vulnerabilities that they can exploit and take those 0 days and be able to weaponize a PDF or somehow breach a two-factor authentication secured network and get into those deeper areas where you actually have value, such as at a utility, such as at a chemical facility. That's really what today's attackers are after. And so what we hear about is really only the tip of the iceberg. We hear about a lot of public cases that are extremely worrisome. But here at FireEye, because we've been able to work in collaboration with a lot of these public and private organizations, there's, let me show you, thousands of more of these types of attacks below the surface. Part of the reason is because there just has not been an effective set of technologies till now to be able to uncover the true scope and scale of the type of attacks that we're seeing out on the internet. So real-world statistics that we've got from our different customers. We do a proof of concept with a lot of utilities and customers and enterprises and departments at the federal government level. And what we're seeing is a median of 400 net new incidents per week per gigabit of traffic monitored. And so let me give you a perspective of what traffic we're analyzing here at FireEye. We've developed a proprietary technology to be able to analyze traffic that has been pre-filtered by firewalls, by intrusion prevention, by web filtering gateways. After the traffic flows through all of those traditional defenses, we perform a last line of defense, if you will, using the FireEye technology. And what we're seeing is that there are 400 net incidents that are still penetrating those defenses, primarily because those are fairly static, fairly signature-based technologies. And what we're proposing and advocating for is more of a real-time signatureless capability so that we can start to uncover these types of infections and begin that incident response of, do you want to block these incidents? Do you want to track the incidents so that you can better target and figure out who the perpetrators are? There's a variety of scenarios, but the key here is that you've got to know before you can start taking any sort of action. You've got to know that there's an infection or an APT attack underway. And so security gap is pretty broad. We're finding that over 95% of companies are compromised, and this is on the more conservative side. We definitely see many, many companies that have incidents of malware brought in by users, but more importantly, we're starting to see a lot of this malware being able to call back out from within the network, outbound through firewalls, through next generation firewalls, because that's just how things are set up. Once the malware gets in, it's fairly straightforward to communicate back out, whether it's to just provide a heartbeat to the cyber criminal to let them know that they're there, or that there is some sort of data exfiltration attempt being perpetrated. So now that I've talked a little bit about the threat landscape, about the world that we live in, I think everybody on the call is here because they understand that these types of attacks are happening in droves. But let me take a step back and actually talk about the nature of the attack themselves. What are they doing? And we can better prepare ourselves if we understand the enemy a little bit better. So the tools that the enemy is using is what I'm going to generically call advanced targeted attacks. They're using unknown vulnerabilities that they can buy or potentially develop on their own. They're taking these vulnerabilities in applications, in operating systems, and using them in a very targeted manner. Because once you purchase a zero-day exploit, you're not going to go ahead and use it in a broad manner because somebody will discover on the good guy side, a security researcher or a victim will discover that there's a zero-day exploit. They'll contact the actual vendor, and eventually that zero-day vulnerability will be patched. And so today's criminals are savvy to that, so they understand that once they get a zero-day, they need to be able to use this in a very targeted manner. And to increase the hit rate, they're going to use polymorphism, dynamic techniques, and even personalization to get these types of URLs through to your end users. So they'll read a spear phishing email and click on a link. How are they able to use these and attach polymorphism and dynamic techniques and personalization? Well, there are commercial toolkits now out there. Criminals and nation states either develop these toolkits or buy them on the open market. $5,000 will get you a toolkit with 1 year of tech support and subscriptions, so that if there's a new zero-day outbreak or new zero-day exploit that's available on the market, on the underground market, you can actually get a subscription notification and you can go buy that zero-day exploit to use in your next cyber criminal campaign. And that's just kind of the nature of how the cyber underground is working today in these advanced targeted attacks. A lot of money involved and fairly fluid in terms of trying to figure out who's doing what, where. So now that the nature of the attack has been described, let's talk about the most common techniques of using that malware to break into your network. That malware is being delivered primarily over 3 vectors: web, email, and files, or application-based attacks. So when I talk about web-based attacks, I think that's fairly straightforward. Most organizations allow some level of web access these days, and especially in critical infrastructure, as Erfan mentioned, with the smart grid initiatives and other initiatives within your organizations, we're just becoming more and more interconnected. And while distributed computing control systems and SCADA systems may not be directly connected to the internet, there are systems that are connected to the internet, and users are using things like USB keys or even online file sharing like Dropbox or Box.net to bring in files that then they sneakernet over to these other systems that are not connected, and boom, you've got an infection happening. And that's how they think that things like Stuxnet happened and was able to infect those utilities and critical infrastructure over in Iran. So they're using web-based attacks, they're using spear phishing emails to deliver those malicious URLs, and oftentimes they're using spear phishing emails to deliver those malicious files as well. It's fairly straightforward today with those criminal toolkits that I just mentioned to take an existing NERC PDF report from the web, take that legitimate content and actually bolt on a zero-day exploit, weaponize that PDF, and then using a spear phishing campaign, they'll email key members within your organization and give them what seemingly looks like a report that's relevant to them. In fact, they're going to open up that attachment and actually see relevant content. They're going to see the report that they were expecting to see without realizing and knowing that there was also a zero-day exploit launched targeting the Adobe Reader that they were using to read that report. And this is the kind of advanced persistent techniques that folks are using to break into today's networks. So what am I saying in summary? Essentially, traditional defenses don't work against advanced targeted attacks. They're so focused, laser focused in penetrating our critical infrastructure networks that you can't rely on signatures or basic heuristics, because those were designed to catch the broad scattershot type attacks. Almost like the 80-20 rule. You've got signatures and heuristics that are useful. They're useful to prevent people from going to places of the internet that you don't want your users to go to. You've got that 80%, the low-grade malware that you can help prevent because it can be easily signaturized. But what do you do about the 20% and growing that's becoming increasingly targeted and getting into your network? And that's what we're here to talk about today. Analysts from Gartner and Forrester are also backing up and trumpeting, in fact, the fact that incumbent defenses simply are falling short. This is not just simply FireEye coming out here and talking about the sky is falling. I think we've entered a new reality, and I think most of the folks who are listening probably are clued into the fact that there is this new reality of a very advanced threat landscape targeting our infrastructure. And the question is, what can we do about it? All right. And so if there's anything that you take away from this presentation, I hope it's on this particular slide, is the fact that not only are we talking about a multi-vector criminal element coming in over web, email, and application-based attacks, but these multi-vectors are being used in multiple stages. And so I'll talk a little bit more about step-by-step what I mean by the multi-stage nature of today's attacks. But I want everybody to be able to understand that it's no longer a, I fire one bullet or I take one pick and try to pick your lock once, and if I don't break in, I'm not going to try again. The adversaries that we're dealing with are typically nation-state level types of funding to be able to penetrate your networks, and they're willing and able to do pretty much anything, to buy 0 days, to develop proprietary techniques to break into your network, to send you USB keys through the mail, to try to fool your users to click on links. And they're going to do this in a multiple stage process so that once they break in, they can then begin to call out and slowly penetrate the systems within the network that are truly of value, and then begin to exfiltrate that data out. And so let me go step by step in terms of talking about the attack lifecycle. So we've covered a lot about the multi-vector nature of today's attacks, the fact that they're using web, email, and blending these techniques with application-based attacks with weaponized files. But from a stage-by-stage or step-by-step process, how is this actually happening? So step one is simply the exploitation of the system. And so that means that I am weaponizing a legitimate PDF and emailing to a select number of users, contacting them potentially on Facebook and seeing if they would be willing to open up or click on that link or open up the file. But once I've exploited that initial system, let's say it's a laptop that is brought home and then brought back into your critical infrastructure network, then I'll begin to install more amounts of malware as step two, stage two. And then once it's on that particular laptop, regardless if it's at home or within the critical infrastructure network, it will begin to call back and establish some sort of control. So that's what we talk about when you hear about command and control servers. These are servers that are set up on hosting networks around the world, and your laptop will then call back to that server and essentially acknowledge the fact that it's been successfully compromised and waiting for next steps. We've actually even seen very sophisticated or maybe rudimentary, depending on how you look at it, command and control servers that are essentially blog servers. The piece of malware will call back and seemingly look like it's downloading a blog web page. That way it can bypass your web URL filter. But what's actually the contents of that blog page are the instructions of where else to download further pieces of malware or what other systems it should be looking to compromise. Stage 4 is the actual data exfiltration. Once the malware has found valuable data on that particular laptop, let's say user credentials, it begins to tie that bundle of data up and send it right back to the command and control server, outbound, right back to the callback server. And once it has been able to essentially take all the information that it needs from that particular laptop, it begins to spread laterally, and that's stage 5. That's when you've got a user who has connectivity to a local file share in your network, and that malware will copy itself or somehow weaponize documents in that network file share, so that as other users open up those files, the goal is obviously to penetrate deeper into the organization, into more and more sensitive systems. And that's what I talk about when I talk about the life cycle of an attack or the multi-stage nature of an attack. And so what can we do about it? Today, the challenge is that you've got point products or traditional products that rely on signatures. That's problem number 1. And even the somewhat more advanced products don't deal with the situation holistically. They might address the web component, but then how about the fact that they're going to be calling back over FTP or IRC? What if they're exfiltrating data using multi-zip or some sort of encrypted archive format? How would you be able to detect that kind of data loss by simply scanning the contents of the traffic? You're not able to do that. You need to be able to put it all together so that you're dealing with not only just a particular channel like web. You need to be able to deal cross-vector as well as address all the stages of the attack, from the actual exploit to executable downloads to the outbound callbacks that are happening. And so this is how we need to start looking at building our defenses to mitigate, disrupt, and prevent the overall damage of an APT. So even though you may get that initial infection of a piece of malware, you can essentially neuter it by preventing it from calling back. And that negates the overall attack, even though you do have some symptoms of the attack. And so let me step through a tactic of an advanced targeted attack. So hopefully this will be more clear. Instead of just talking vaguely about stages, let's take a look at what would happen. So step 1, you've got a user that uses Facebook, or let's say that this is just Gmail or Twitter. They're reading a message on the web. There's a shortened URL that says, hey, this might be very interesting for you. Take a look. They click on that link and they go out to the internet. They're downloading legitimate content again, whether it's New York Times with a weaponized banner advertisement that does not even come from New York Times. Maybe it's a PDF that's relevant to them, but again, it's weaponized. And so step 3, because they downloaded that content, they initiated the communication. It's going to go right through the firewall, and they're downloading content. They're going to get that infection on their laptop. At that point, the attacker is going to attempt to move around the local system, grab system credentials, download further Trojans to install a backdoor, and then communicate that content back out to the network. And this is why current defense technologies fall short, because something like a Facebook or a Gmail that's going to be encrypted, let's say, is going to go right through your firewall. Spear phishing is going to elude anti-spam technologies very easily because it's going to be personalized in such a way that it says, "Dear Dan, this is something that's going to be super relevant to you," and it's content that normally you would flag as important or good. The Secure Web Gateway is looking for URLs either on its blacklist or domains that it's known to host bad content. But what if this is legitimate content that happens to be weaponized or corrupted in some way? Or if it's a dynamic URL, it's so dynamic that URL filters would not know whether or not to block it or not. And so for the most part, those dynamic one-time URLs are allowed through the web URL gateways. As a result, desktop AV, again, signature-based, these types of things are not proving effective in being able to stop this latest generation of attacks. And so this is kind of a, for your notes purposes, this slide just walks through each layer of the typical security architecture and discusses in brief how it is that today's criminals are able to bypass each step. In summary, for this particular slide is the fact that we're relying on largely static techniques to stop the known malware in the world. We use known ports that they use, known protocols that they're known to communicate over, known signatures for the MD5 of the binary. By using these known quantities, we're able to stop a lot of the known malware, and that's why cyber criminals are increasingly moving towards that unknown malware. And let me tell you about a study that FireEye conducted last year talking about the dynamism of malware. And so when we talk about binary MD5s, this is the actual software application, the executable that's downloaded onto your PC. And MD5 is essentially a digital fingerprint of that software program. It is unique to every program. And so each program, even when you add a patch or you add a plugin to the browser, it's going to have a different MD5. And so what we did in our study was to take a look at what is the uniqueness of the MD5s and what's the lifetime of that MD5. So we know we've got a malicious binary that gets downloaded. In what amount of time does that binary morph or change its digital signature? You know, how quickly does it change its MD5? And essentially within 1 day, we're seeing close to 90% of those software applications changing their MD5. So meaning that after 1 day, 90% of all that known malware becomes unknown again because it's morphing its signature. It's changing its MD5. And so that's one way that criminals are getting around AV and other types of attempts to stop it on the endpoint. Another aspect is the use of malicious domain names. Why don't we just put in the malicious domain names into some sort of list and block any communications to those malicious domain names? Sounds great. That's what URL filters talk about, and that's what they're able to do when you subscribe to those blacklists. However, criminals also know that you're doing this, and so they're going to change the malicious domains and make them dynamic. So how long does the actual malicious domain stay alive? And again, we're seeing almost 89 to 90% changing within 1 day. And within 7 days, we nearly have 98% of all malicious domains changing. They're either changing using dynamic algorithms so that the URL will connect to a new domain name, or they will actually just use a new targeted misspelling and morph in that manner. So suffice it to say, this is the cyber criminals technique to bypass URL filtering. And overall, when we take a look at the various families of malware, along the x-axis, we've got the malware rank. So let's say the first 300, the top 300 families of malware. And then the y-axis is the fraction of cases that it's accounted for. So if we look at, let's say, the top 50 malware families, if you go up the y-axis, the blue line, it's going to account for almost 78% of all known infections. That's great. If I can somehow create signatures or dynamic signatures for these top 50 families, we can deal with 78% supposedly. Now, the trick is that the slope increases or decreases very quickly to 0, where we're looking at this long tail where the 250 and above families of malware essentially are thousands and thousands of different malware that exists that you would need to have some sort of signature to be able to stop. And that's really the direction that cyber criminals are going. They're increasing the number of variants they're creating polymorphic versions of the malware so they can, once they get onto your laptop, they can change very, very quickly. And that's what makes them so difficult to deal with. You can kill the low grade because they don't change fast enough, but the high grade types of malware that are used against high value targets like critical infrastructure networks, that's really the reason that today's attacks are so successful. And so let me talk a little bit about a case study and kind of step you through one of the organizations that we help to protect here at FireEye and what we found on their network. And so we have a regional utility. It's one of the largest U.S. Regional utilities that produces and provides both electricity and natural gas to its customers. And what they were looking to do is begin protecting on the web security side, because I think that they were able to very quickly understand that the web was one of the main points of entry for all the different types of malware that they were seeing on their network. When they're doing a proof of concept, they were noticing thousands of unintended callbacks due to malware coming out of their network. And then as time wore on, they started seeing hundreds, upwards to thousands of inbound malware attacks as well. So they were significantly concerned that the web was allowing malware and cyber criminals to transact and steal their data. And so what they found with the FireEye Web MPS was that there's a bunch of benefits of being able to not only stop these outbound communications, but they were able to dive into the rich forensics that our product provides. And I'm obviously happy to talk more about our technology and how it works and how we're able to give you the malware forensics, a copy of the malware that was infected in your network, and even a picture of the types of data that the malware was attempting to exfiltrate. And in terms of what actually precipitated the event, it was a spear phishing attack that contained malicious attachments sent only to the mid and high-level energy executives at this company. It contained a zip file that operated and targeted only Windows 7. And knowing that there was Windows 7 deployed in that network, it was able to successfully execute and exploit that system and infect it. It then sent back callbacks to initiate the further exploitation and disruption of that particular network. As I mentioned, we also protect certain national labs, and in this use case was very similar in the sense that they are looking to protect against web-based intrusions. And at the time of this particular deployment, we had not released the email security product that we have that helps to protect against the blended threat of web and email-based attacks. And so they're in the process of deploying that as we speak. And I think the final concept that I'll go over is what I'll call threat actors, to get into the mindset of what is actually going on in this underground cyber economy. I've talked a lot about the ways, the channels, and the multi-stage nature of the attacks. I've talked a lot about the tools that they use in terms of the advanced targeted attacks, the types of malware, the Trojans, the fact that these weapons that they're using are highly dynamic. And let me leave you with this last element of the criminal behavior. So there are three large groups of threat actors that I'll propose. The APT actors, these would be potentially nation states that are seeking to disrupt the U.S. critical infrastructure for purposes of further attack or potentially cyber warfare. There are the Crimeware actors. These are the folks that are just infecting systems to infect systems. They use them as spam engines once they infect an end system. They use them as storage points, distributed storage, to store all the illegal wares that they download. They use it to somehow monetize, steal personalized financial credentials, for example. And so that's your typical Crimeware actor. And then you've got the hacktivists, the folks who have an axe to grind, who are out there to prove a point. And so if you look at these three different groups, the nation state, the APT actors, are certainly the best funded and the ones looking for zero-day exploits. And those are the ones that are actually stealing the source code of the, the various vendors I mentioned before to steal the single sign-on system so that they can track, activists in their country. But what we're also seeing is that there's a behavior behind the APT actors interacting with the Crimeware actors. And this is a very important point to note, because not every attack is going to be a zero-day attack against your network. It could actually just be that low-grade infection that was polymorphic and the user installed it himself or herself. And that would be your kind of Zeus Trojan or some sort of basic Crimeware that's installed. But once the Crimeware actor knows that they have an asset within a critical infrastructure network, they actually have ways to communicate with these APT actors and sell them the compromised system. And the reason that you do this is because, again, as an APT actor, I don't want to burn my 0 days. If I don't have to use a 0 day to break into your critical infrastructure network, I'm not going to. I can just buy access. I'm going to go ahead and do it that way. Because what the APT actors are concerned about is burning that 0 day. Once they use it or use it too often, they know that the time window of usage, the half-life, if you will, of that 0 day is decreasing very, very quickly. Somebody will get their hands on it from a security researcher standpoint or a vendor standpoint and patch that vulnerability. And they don't want that to happen. Once they use a 0 day and they find that it's been patched or somehow it's been protected against, they'll actually sell those 0 day exploits to the Crimeware actors, because the Crimeware actors, again, are doing mass scale infections. They know not everybody is patched. So, give me a 2 day exploit versus a 0 day exploit. I'll pay, a quarter of the price for that 2 day exploit and be able to infect millions of machines, because that's how I make money. And that's the kind of interaction that we see right now. In this particular case, the Wermud Trojan, this is pretty much exactly how it played out. Back in March 2011, the Trojan and the 0 day that I exploited was created and used. We started to create and protect against this back in March last year. And at that point in April, the APT actors realized that the gig was up, and they actually started to sell Wermud or pass it along to other Crimeware actors in their network for the sake of being able to get access to the other high-value networks that the Crimeware actors had access to. And by June, 3 months later, we could start seeing that same Trojan exploit technique being used to deliver fake antivirus, which is a typical piece of Crimeware used to monetize infected systems. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that you know about the advanced malware, you know about the various techniques that's using to get into your network. The final dynamic I wanted to introduce was the fact that the various actors that you see out there that are using malware, they are people, and people with motivations, and they're interacting in such a way so that they can get the easiest access into this critical infrastructure network, so that you need to pay attention to these low-grade attacks. Even though it seems like a Zeus Trojan is not as important as a very targeted Stuxnet type of an attack, they could be equivalent, because a Zeus Trojan could be sold to an APT actor, allowing backdoor access right into your network. And so that's just something to pay attention to. And for my last slide, I'll leave you with what we call the 5 principles of disrupting next-generation threats. Because when we look at stopping the next generation of threats, by understanding that there's a multi-vector nature to it, you need to be able to coordinate a response across web, email, and files. We also know that it's a multi-stage attack, so that you can disrupt the attack at each and every one of those stages to prevent the overall damage that's being produced. And so that's why, to me, it's so critical to understand that it's a multi-vector, multi-stage set of attacks that are being hurled at your networks, and that you need to have a variety of techniques to be able to disrupt it at each stage. And so tip number 1 is to build upon your defense in-depth architecture. Realize that the typical technologies that we're using at all of those layers in defense in-depth are typically reliant on signatures or lists, so meaning largely static. And because each layer is not really differentiated from a technology standpoint, I'm suggesting that we introduce more dynamic signature list capabilities in the defense in-depth architecture. You really need a layer that becomes dynamic so that it can adjust to the tactics as the criminals are adjusting their tactics. It needs to be a real-time type protection to stop data exfiltration. As I mentioned with the dynamism of domain names, cyber criminals are on the move constantly. And so it's very, very difficult to use a blacklist to prevent data exfiltration over the web, for example. Or if the criminals decide to use other protocols, very difficult unless you're doing some sort of real-time analysis and monitoring of outbound traffic as well. You need to be able to integrate protection across web and email, because oftentimes we're seeing spear phishing emails being sent into the network that contain malicious URLs as well as malicious files. So maybe you can strip out the EXEs or zips from all the emails coming in. But what are you going to do about embedded links and things like that? These are very common features of today's email communications, and so it makes it very, very difficult to strip out. And so as a result, you need some sort of system that can cross-correlate where are these URLs coming from, are they safe for my users to click on, and be able to protect users from themselves, essentially. The holy grail, of course, is being accurate, have little tuning, and a very low false positive rate. These are some of the key elements that continue to hold back even our signature-based technologies. As people try to write more generic signatures to do more regex type matching, they're running to very meaningful false positive rates, limiting the effectiveness and usefulness of those types of security products, and that's where they've hit the ceiling. And the last tip is that we need to be able to, as a global entity, we're all becoming very, very interconnected. We need to be able to do real-time malware intelligence. If you are seeing an attack in your particular critical infrastructure network, most likely that's going to hit a utility near you as well. And so we have information sharing networks like the ISACs, but what we also need would be automated malware intelligence communication networks so that we can share this stuff in real time without having to get email lists and people involved before it's too late. And so with that, I want to thank everybody for joining, and I think we've got some time for some questions now.
Thank you very much, Phil. And yes, we do have 3 questions to start out with, and I'm sure others are formulating it. Mike Shea asks, which victim would make the initiator of the malware most happy? The general users of a product or the producer of the product under attack?
Interesting question. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I'll answer it to the best of my understanding. Which victim would make the initiators of the malware most happy? I think that in general, today we're looking at levels of access into your network. So as you build your network out, you obviously have some sort of access controls so that, users have privileged levels of access and some users have, very basic levels of access. What we're finding is that criminals are very patient, especially the APT sort of actors. They're very patient in compromising even a basic level user so that they can get to those higher credentialed, more privileged user sets. So obviously folks who have system level access to the core SCADA or DCS areas, those will be high value targets, of course. But if I can't get directly to those targets, I'll go to their subordinates or to their colleagues who may have access to similar systems that then I could penetrate the core systems. And that's what we found in the case of RSA, for example. The RSA attack was a spear phishing attack that sent an Excel spreadsheet that contained an Adobe Flash 0-day. It's a kind of weird combination of attack and file vectors, but again, they essentially sent a weaponized Excel spreadsheet. It went to about a half dozen individuals at RSA, and the name of the file, the Excel spreadsheet, was Recruitment Plan 2011. And so, sort of compelling. I believe it was folks in either an IT security or potentially a finance function that ended up opening that particular Excel spreadsheet, weaponized Excel spreadsheet, that then began and kicked off the overall APT attack. And so to some degree, it no longer matters. Criminals are pretty much willing to start anywhere once they can get a foothold or toehold in your network. But there certainly are more high-value assets like your executives, like your system administrators, who you want to make sure are locked down. But that's actually why criminals are trying to steal secure ID, two-factor authentication source code. Once they steal that, it'll be that much easier to break into your high-value assets, credentials and systems.
Okay, Sandeep Saxena asks, how do you protect against future attack that you have no signatures for or dormant malware already in your system?
A great question. The no signature part is one of the elements of our technology here at FireEye. It is fairly unique, and so pardon me for kind of this vendor-biased pitch, but essentially this was the reason that FireEye was invented. As Erfan mentioned, Ashar has a deep, deep background working on some of the first firewalls that were ever invented. He was a major contributor to the public key infrastructure that we have, PKI. He did a lot of that nascent work, and one of the things that he discovered in looking at IT security in the whole landscape is that there needs to be a way to do this signatureless type analysis. And so with the advent of virtualization and the ability to virtualize a computer 100% accurately, meaning that you take Windows operating systems and install it on this virtualized hardware with all that's good, bad, and different. All the Windows bugs, all the application bugs that run on Windows, all those things are installed in this virtual hardware. So the virtual machine is as vulnerable as a physical machine. And so we took that fundamental principle and that fundamental understanding and applied it to IT security. So we have a virtual machine that essentially tests your network traffic, and if the virtual machine becomes infected, guess what? We know some sort of system exploitation is happening. And because we've run this zero-day malware in our virtual environment, we can fingerprint it, we can do callback analysis to prevent it from calling back out to the cyber criminal. We can take a range of actions to prevent that zero-day exploit from affecting and actually stealing and compromising the data integrity within your network. So we're using virtual machines to do real-time analysis in a signatureless manner is maybe the summary of answer to your question. And in terms of how do you detect dormant malware already in the network, that's a very good question, because oftentimes we're finding that malware simply walks into your network. You've got employees that are diligent, they're working from home, they're working at work, they're working overtime, and they're bringing laptops and other files from home back into the main network. And as a result, you now have dormant malware, or you have malware that is somehow introduced into the network. How do you detect that? Great question. And this is where you need to have some sort of outbound detection and outbound communication filtering. You need to be able to understand and monitor the traffic that's leaving your network to make sure that they're not trying to communicate to a known command and control server in the Ukraine or a known command and control server over in mainland China. These are things that are possible given today's technologies. If you can monitor traffic inbound, why can't you monitor it outbound? And that's part of what we're advocating, is you need to be able to do callback analysis as well.
Thanks. The next question is from Mike Shea, who asks, by the way, Sandeep also praises this presentation, says excellent presentation, and I concur. Mike Shea says, BYOD has become a set trend now. Do you see some possibility of mandating the BYOD vendors, hardware and software alike, to comply to certain malware infection prevention practice?
Well, yeah, bring your own device is very tricky because of the fact that IT is going down that slippery slope of not being able to control the endpoint environment. makes it extremely difficult to protect that endpoint environment, because if users are bringing their own devices, it could be a variety of mobile platforms. Maybe it's a netbook running Android or Chrome. Maybe it is an legacy Windows XP system that they're just bringing in from home. How do you deal with that? And that's really where we have to have this mix of protection mechanisms, arguably at the network, so that we're scrubbing that web traffic that's coming in, scrubbing the email that's coming in before it reaches the endpoint, as well as doing that outbound type analysis. Because even though somebody's going to bring in a home laptop that's running Windows XP, if it's infected and it's calling back out, we know we can now flag and identify that there's an infected system within the utility network. Now, in terms of the possibility of mandating BYOD vendors to comply, from our standpoint, compliance has proven to be a necessary thing, but far from sufficient in terms of actually offering true security against APTs. There are a bunch of different standards out there, like the NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards that are out, but they're kind of there to define a minimum level of security, not the true level of security given the risk profile of your organization. If you are on the eastern seaboard controlling electricity or natural gas pipelines for tens of millions of people, you have probably a higher risk of being penetrated as a smaller utility that is just doing research on these types of energy usages. So the risk profile varies very significantly among groups, and so to simply meet a minimum standard is not going to necessarily protect all involved. So it's pretty important to understand that there probably is unlikely to have an effective malware infection prevention practice as far as it goes from a compliance standpoint.
We have Jeff St. John from Green Tech Media who is asking, how much are utilities spending on cybersecurity? How much should they be spending?
That's a great question. I think that there are a lot of initiatives underway at utilities. I know that a couple of years ago, the federal government had allocated several $billion in the economic stimulus package to spur innovation in utilities, smart grid included, renewable energies included, and unfortunately, at least from our standpoint, again, as a vendor speaking, I think that utilities in general are underinvesting in the cybersecurity aspect as we move aggressively along these other paths of upgrading our technologies to enable smart meters at the home. How about the security implications and privacy implications of deploying smart meters at the home? That was something that recently came up here in California. I think that these organizations like PG&E are taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and realizing that they do need to invest in cybersecurity. From a dollar standpoint, I can't speak specifics. I actually don't know specifically the percentage of budget that utilities are allocating to cybersecurity, but my sense is that it's not enough because there are so many competing forces right now to upgrade our grid to make it more robust as we use more and more amounts of energy. So my sense is that cybersecurity is not exactly the highest of priorities, even though I think it should be hand in hand given the fact that if criminals or cyber terrorists or hacktivists are able to disrupt our energy supply, it would have massive consequences.
And I think that the point that you made about NERC critical infrastructure protection specifications is a good one, because in addition to that, we also have to focus on security and reliability, and NERC itself admits to that and has two divisions within it, one that deals with the compliance side and one that deals with security and reliability, because there is a certain dynamic aspect to protection, and compliance by its nature is regressive, and hackers are always looking to exploit around those specifications. So I think that one of the challenges that many utilities have is that so much time and energy has been put in NERC compliance that it is taking away from the time and energy that they have on the security and reliability side. But I am seeing some changes that are occurring as the NERC SIP requirements are coming to maturity. We have
Absolutely.
a question from Efren Gonzalez of Southern California Edison, who asks, Phil, can you spend a couple of minutes explaining how your dynamic signature-less engine works? I think you've answered it somewhat, but if you'd like to elaborate a little more.
Sure, definitely happy to. I think that taking a step back, again, the FireEye type technology is a component in the overall response to what we're seeing as advanced targeted attacks. You've got to be able to find it to deal with it, and that's kind of where we're coming from. But in terms of dealing with the overall advanced targeted attack, where do you go from there? A lot of this has to do with your own internal processes and your own incident response capabilities. Do you need an outside firm to come in to help with the legal proceedings of how you want to respond to infected systems? A lot of our utilities are public entities as well, so there are different regulatory requirements. And so just to be clear and set the stage is that, our technology is a lot about preventing and mitigating the overall effect. You've got to be able to detect it and find it to stop it. However, we're just a piece of the overall puzzle to address the overall cybersecurity landscape that we live in now. And as far as the actual signatureless technology that we've developed, we've got a technology engine that we call the virtual execution engine. And as implied by the name, we virtually execute email attachments, web URLs, file types that sit on your file shares within these virtual environments. So we execute or detonate these potentially harmful attachments in a virtual environment running Windows, XP, Windows 7, various SP service packs in those operating systems, and we see if it's going to try to do some sort of system exploitation. And so when I talk about system exploitation, it would be something like a buffer overflow in memory. An application properly written, a file, a PDF, should not create a buffer overflow situation. However, a weaponized PDF oftentimes does. It will try to overwrite parts of memory to be able to inject malicious source code, corrupt a DLL, and gain a toehold onto your system. And that's what we're able to detect in a signatureless manner using our virtual execution environment. When the malware is actually installed in that VX environment, we're then able to install the malware to its fruition, to its total completion, so we can see all the registry keys it's trying to change, all the DLLs it's trying to change, giving you essentially all the information forensics-wise, cyber forensics-wise, to be able to dissect and potentially remediate those end systems. Furthermore, because we install the malware to its full completion, we can see it calling out. We have a virtual DNS essentially built into the appliance. We don't actually allow the malware to call back out into the broad internet, but we have a virtual DNS that will respond and capture the malware callback destinations. And in that way, we can create a dynamic signature to block any other systems already on your network, physical systems, from calling to that same CNC source. And so there's a multitude of methods and techniques that we're putting in this virtual environment and instrumenting it to be able to do real-time malware forensics, real-time malware exploitation detection, and real-time malware callback blocking to kind of address each of these stages of the malware lifecycle.
We have Larry Duran, who asks, what steps have been taken by Siemens and others to mitigate penetration of their PLCs on SCADA?
Well, I think that, so I can't speak necessarily for Siemens itself. I know that the vulnerabilities that were exposed in the Siemens critical infrastructure products are being addressed and patched, as I understood it. The trouble, however, is that they don't necessarily control all layers of the software stack. There are certain operating system and other third-party computers that would connect into their SCADA system that could potentially be compromised. And these are the types of things that are potentially out of their control. And so that's how these attacks are coming to fruition and being successful in the first place. You kind of attack the weakest point of vulnerability, namely, unfortunately, a Windows system, typically running an Adobe piece of software these days, or running Java. We just recently heard a lot about the zero-day Java vulnerability that the FireEye research team uncovered and alerted Oracle to. And Oracle came out and did an emergency patch out of cycle. Right now, everybody is doing their best trying to patch these systems, but that to me makes the case for real-time monitoring more important than ever, because you can't realistically expect a giant corporation like Siemens or an Oracle to come out and patch their software fast enough given the criticalness of your infrastructure and your network. You need some other third-party security-focused capability to either block that callback, alert you to the existence of an attack, and potentially disconnect or reconnect or reconfigure your network on the fly so that you can prevent any kind of larger damage happening beyond a simple infection.
Next question from Dave Erickson. He says, in your view, what is the most vulnerable area of utility operations to cyber attack? I don't know if you really want to answer this question, but
at this point, I think that it is just simply I think that the way to put this is that we're on the defensive, and as whether utility or an enterprise or a federal government, we've been pushed back on our heels given the lack of innovation in the defensive technologies. And so as a result, we might say the users are, your basic users, the most vulnerable place, and restrict their usage of the internet, or you've got high-level executives, you want to make sure that they're protected. Give them 2 or 3 laptops, one for home use, one for random use at work, and then one is a privileged, do only the most sensitive information on the 3rd computer. And that's what some organizations have to go to. But even then, they're still getting infected. So in terms of the most vulnerable parts, I think in general it's just that our defensive technologies as a whole haven't been kept up to snuff. It's like trying to defend our networks using shields that were good against bows and arrows, but frankly the criminals are using nuclear armament against us to penetrate our networks. I mean, it's becoming that easy, unfortunately. And that's why when we do these statistics and studies, the fact that we say that 95% of networks are compromised, it sounds a little outrageous, so I'm sorry for that, but those are actually the facts.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things from a utility operations perspective. One is that the business process, and we're going to be talking a little bit about this on September 18th when we'll be talking about business process security. And Partha Datta Ray of Albedo is going to be talking about the need for securing business processes. But one of the challenges that utilities face is that with the advent of so many independent power producers who are now connecting to the grid, we're no longer talking about a single trust domain. And the way each entity deals with security is different because their cultures are different. So I think one of the vulnerabilities that utilities face is that as they create these peering relationships with their independent power producers, are they sure that those IPPs and their infrastructure don't have those holes that you've been talking about in your presentation from which attacks can be launched into the utility? So that's one vulnerability that I would encourage utilities to look at. And then the second one is about how the enterprise side and the power system side are increasingly getting more and more touch points in order to create operational efficiency. And what exposures do those create? You mentioned that SCADA is usually not connected to the web. However, when you have the meter data management system that is sitting on the enterprise side of the organization, but then you have the OMS that requires information from the MDM, how do you create the proper protection and create those boundaries so that those exploits don't occur? Because the enterprise side, as you mentioned correctly, does have connections to the Internet, if not directly, through these USB ports and memory sticks and so on. So it's this data integration for operational efficiency that is leading to new threat vectors. So I wanted you to comment on that a little bit.
Sure. A great point. I mean, when we look at the attack like Stuxnet, it was seemingly USB delivered. Flame, again, these types of malware that are highly, highly effective. I think Flame was about 20 megabytes in size with keystroke capture, camera. It could activate the camera on your laptop if you had one. It could activate the microphone on your laptop, which we pretty much all have, and record your conversations. I mean, that's how sophisticated the malware is. And then in terms of being able to protect against file-based or this type of disconnected system is very, very difficult. There are technological aspects. So for example, some organizations have gotten to the point of scanning all the files that are on a USB stick in something like a FireEye virtual execution engine. So all the files that you'd like to bring into the SCADA environment, crossing that Chinese wall, if you will, you would have to scan those files first in a VX engine-like environment before you could take that USB stick and plug it into the SCADA system or disconnected system. Now, that sounds great in principle. You just need to somehow be able to enforce that procedure among your users, which for these organizations are fairly straightforward. There's a limited user set that can actually have that kind of SCADA access anyway to bring files over, and so there's just a new step in the process. So that's one way to deal with it. Hopefully that answers that part of the question. So.
Yes. So we have Jeff St. John asking, how ready are utilities to enable the kind of security you say we need to see for APT attacks? Is there a problem with existing utility IT systems not being able to get here from there, so to speak, in some fundamental way? They've been built via legacy systems, etc. So what he's asking is, are there any current showstoppers to putting the kind of technology you were describing in the utility infrastructure? And from what it looks like, you've already shown a case study where someone benefited from your technology in the utility industry.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got several utilities, one of the largest here in the West Coast as a customer, as well as some regional utilities in the Midwest that are utilizing our technology. And for the most part, there does not, at least from my marketing standpoint, have any limitations in terms of being able to make use of our technology. We have more recently introduced a file-based product, and so protecting against web-based threats, we've done that for many, many years now. Email-based threats, we started doing that in 2010. And this past year, we released a product called the File MPS in 2012, where we're actually protecting against files that will migrate into your network file shares. So this is the actual product that we would use to scan your network file shares for the presence of malware that's copied itself from an infected laptop into the network file share, seeking to expose itself to other victims. So could we be used in a utility standpoint? Yes, absolutely. And I think there's another kind of question about embedded systems and protecting those. We have not yet virtualized those embedded systems in our virtual execution environment, so they are not necessarily addressed with our current set of products. However, our technology foundation is there. You virtualize the hardware, you install the embedded system OS and custom proprietary applications that you may have developed with unknown vulnerabilities to your team, and we can perform that same virtual execution analysis on that system, that virtualized system, to see if there are attacks targeting you specifically. So the potential is certainly there, and that's, to me, one of the pluses in investing in a FireEye-like technology, because there has to be a roadmap to future capabilities so that as we morph into more of a mobile environment and you're running different types of operating systems, how can we extend this technology platform to cover those other kinds of operating systems like an embedded system? And to me, at FireEye, we've got a clear answer, because we are using a generic platform underneath to virtualize hardware to then install the actual vulnerable software that we need to protect. And there was another question about a lot of IT teams taking on their own security and building their own security. To a large degree, I see this happening because you know your company the best. You know your own security practices the best. And there are certain cases where build your own security makes sense. However, given the state of cybersecurity tools that are available from folks like FireEye, forensics tools from folks like Encase, there are tools out there to make your life easier, and there's an element of why not invest in these tools that have a measurable improvement in the security response time, and then you've got more time to dedicate to create that customized layer of security that you're talking about. Most organizations, I find, are still in the midst of deploying some of the basic compliance mandated security elements, looking at some of the advanced targeted attack protection that we offer here at FireEye, and then that actually helps to deprioritize those initiatives to build your own security, because frankly, are you going to be able to build your security fast enough so that the criminals won't adjust to it? You know, if they make one simple change, your 6 to 12 months worth of investment in developing your own security just went down the drain. So these are the kinds of considerations as companies pursue a build your own strategy.
Just a related question. You're not limited to just malware that runs on IP networks or is relevant to IP networks. I mean, there are a lot of systems in the operations side of utilities that run on serial interfaces like DNP protocol and so on that don't necessarily require IP, but yet they could be vulnerable to malware of that kind. So are you limited to IP type networks, or are you looking, is your visibility really cross-domain?
I can't speak to some of the more specific protocols that you just mentioned, but the technology platform as a whole is cross-domain. So meaning that if we were needing to create callback detection capabilities on other proprietary protocols or utility-specific protocols, it certainly is possible.
Okay, very good. Because that is really important in the migration. I think for the next, I can say easily 7 to 10 years, we're going to be seeing a non-IP environment slowly moving out as products reach the end of their life cycle. And so it will be important to protect across the domain and not be limited to just the IP portion of the network. The next question from Dave Erickson says, do you think non-NERC critical assets in the distribution network need to have NERC-CIP type compliance standards? I would just like to make a comment before, and then you can respond to this. The advent of aggregators who are doing demand response can have in megawatts thresholds that can cross 300 megawatts easily. And more of these companies are coming, the likes of Comverge and Enernoc and others. So currently there is no regulation from NERC on those because it's not a single plant. But it's a virtual plant, but saving is just like generation. So they are a critical asset because of the collective. And we also discussed the fact that even if we have NERC-CIP compliance for those types of assets, it doesn't necessarily protect or secure. It just provides some minimum guidelines. So with that, I'll let you respond, Phil.
Sure. Good question. I think that when we really look at the what I call the information supply chain, the players that are involved in building our critical infrastructure, creating it, sustaining it, maintaining it, building, increasing it, and scaling it, they're all potential targets because they all have some level of access that if you disrupted For example, at least from the technical side of the world, where I pay attention to a lot more, if you have a little motor that is installed in hard drives across the world, and that little motor is disrupted, you've got a major disruption in the entire supply chain of creating hard drives. And that's what happened in the natural disaster in Thailand not so long ago. The flooding in Thailand took out a couple of different factories that manufactured this very specialized motor that runs our hard drives, and it had the potential of disrupting our entire hard drive laptop chain, supply chain for computers and laptops and storage devices and all these types of things with that one takedown, if you will, that one natural disaster. And if you just imagine that there's a human planned type disaster, it certainly is very important to pay attention to the supply chain. And again, we are seeing criminals behaving that way. This isn't just a theoretical conversation. They are attacking the weakest links so that they can get access to the more secure links. I will attack Symantec, or I will attack an RSA who doesn't necessarily think that they're going to be attacked, or I'll be very persistent about attacking them because it's easier to attack and break in and steal the secure ID algorithms than it is to break into a defense contractor's network right off the bat. But that's exactly what they did. They stole the secure ID algorithms, started targeting defense contractors, and then as a result, RSA obviously very quickly responded and have released new technologies in their key fobs, and they had to reissue $100 million worth of key fobs, I believe. So, not to necessarily say bad things about RSA. I mean, RSA was a victim here and had to take a heavy toll to rectify the situation. But this is the behavior of the cyber criminals. They're targeting everybody in that supply chain to cause many and major disruptions.
Okay, very good. We have just a little over 10 minutes, but what I wanted to do is just, because there are 4 or 5 questions, to just keep the responses as brief as possible. One is Chris King asking, have you seen any security breaches of smart meters?
Not that I know of. I have read about privacy concerns around smart meters and the ability to read some of the data off of the smart meters. However, I have not seen any particular attack against smart meters.
One thing on smart meters is that the value of the asset grows exponentially as the exploit would go deeper and deeper into the infrastructure, starting from the smart meter, which will at best disrupt a house, to an access point which could potentially hit hundreds, if not low thousands of homes, and then the head end, which could be talking to millions of homes. So depending on how far a breach will reach, it could affect a sizable group. And it could be something as little and nuisance as turning things on and off, but it would cause major disruption in the just-in-time equilibrium between supply and demand of electricity. So it has the potential of being quite dangerous. And the key thing there is that at every stage there needs to be plenty of verification.
Hi, Erfan?
Yes.
I'm sorry, you're fading in and out.
Oh, okay. So the point on the AMI and smart meter security was that depending on how far the security breach gets to, it can have a different level of impact on the utility and its infrastructure. So starting with the smart meter, which would affect a home, to an access point, which could hit hundreds of homes, if not low thousands, to the head end, and the MDM that could potentially affect millions of homes. So simple commands like turning a meter on and off for electricity can have quite an impact on the equilibrium between supply and demand. Okay, next question from Mike Shea says, I've heard some utility exec talking about his or her utility company wanted to build their own security and IT teams to take care of the cybersecurity issues at hand. Would you please share your insight on this type of initiatives?
Sure. Yeah, that's part of the discussion before. Your question actually is what prompted my response before. But to summarize, I think that the build your own security, especially around processes and incident response, those are critical because you understand your teams, the people involved, and the customers, the end users that you service. So there are certainly a lot of build your own initiatives that are necessary. And then I think my recommendation was to revisit or take a look at some of the new tools out there that will help make your build your own initiatives more successful and easier to deploy and maintain over time. Because of the changing cyber landscape, the actual security mechanisms that are used to detect and flag the malware, for example, those tend to be the things that you don't want to necessarily build on your own because it requires a heavy investment in terms of engineering. We've got a world-class research team here at FireEye to keep its pulse on these cyber attacks, both targeted and generally widespread. We're taking cyber actions on our own on things like the Grum botnet, for example. You might have heard that being taken down. That was our research team working with collaborators around the world. So, there's a big investment that would be necessary to build that type of security, but there's certainly core elements in terms of processes that you would have to build on your own.
Next question from Dave Erickson. Is your tool more oriented to preventing breach by outsiders or preventing malicious action by insiders? Which is a greater threat?
Great question. We are focused mostly on that outside cyber third-party actor threat. So the cyber actors that I mentioned before, whether it's an APT actor, Crimeware actor, those are the types of threat actors that we're seeking to protect your network from. In terms of malicious insiders, typically malicious insiders will use some elements of malware to conduct their activities, and so we would protect against that. However, you may be talking more about data loss prevention, and so that would be another unique set of technologies that we are not, that I'm not talking about in terms of what our FireEye tool sets deal with.
Next question we have, Sandeep Saxena says, how can one get a copy of this presentation? I'll be emailing that in a couple of days with the webcast recording. Next question from Dave Erickson, do you have any particular solution for embedded systems or ICS, which is industrial control?
Right, and so as I briefly mentioned, again, your question I think helped prompt my prior answer of the fact that our platform is extensible to be applicable for new operating systems and other operating systems as they become more widely deployed. From our standpoint, from a security standpoint, you probably have more control over your embedded system, what goes on it, what goes out of it. What's really the point of vulnerability are these other systems, the Windows systems, the mobile systems, the laptops that are coming in and out being used by your end users. So that's why we focus predominantly on kind of the weakest link in your security architecture.
Very good. And the last question is also from Dave Erickson, and I think you've addressed some of this in your comments. What about malware introduced via USB like Stuxnet? Do you see solutions to prevent this type of attack?
Yeah, and so we've got kind of the real-time monitoring using our web and email products. We actually have another, believe it or not, we have yet another product called Malware Analysis System that is used exactly for this use case, so that users would scan all the files that they wanted to move into the higher level secured network, and you would actually have to pass through a malware analysis VX engine scan before you could actually take the data from the less secure or lower classified network into the higher classified network. And so that use case certainly does exist, and we've got the malware analysis product for kind of hands-on individual file scanning and for this purpose. And then in case of other things like Stuxnet that would hide in file shares or USB keys, the file malware protection system I talked about would scan USB keys, would scan file shares for presence of malware, 0-day or known.
Very good. Thank you so much, Phil, for joining this webinar and sharing your thoughts. I think that the key takeaways from your presentation are certainly that these types of threats and the attacks from these threats are on the rise, and we need greater situational awareness of our enterprise in order to protect against them, and that there is a certain dynamic nature to them, so we can never just relax and say that we are protected. We have to constantly look at the new exploits and work collectively to mitigate the risks associated with them. And I also think that as we move towards more open standards-based protocols that are vetted by people of different skill sets across the industry, we'll be able to more quickly identify vulnerabilities and deal with them. Quite often we find with proprietary type protocols that only a few people know about it, and if some of them have nefarious intentions, then they can keep exploiting it for a long time. But with open standards-based protocols, one of the nice things about a lot of the open source software has been that there have been many, many eyes looking at it and reviewing it. So technologies like FireEye and others are going to be very helpful in dealing with these new types of threats. So we really appreciate Phil. Oh, by the way, before we end this, there was a situation about a year and a half ago where several national labs were hit with a type of malware through an email system. I thought I'd give you a minute or two to brag a little bit about what you were able to do for some of them that were your customers.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, absolutely. There were some serious attacks, as I mentioned before, that are coming in through email. And with the virtual execution engine type analysis, we were able to identify not only the malware that was coming through, but also the other potential victims. And that's what I mean when I talk about cross-correlation between web and email security products. You need to be able to tell where the threat's coming in. Maybe it's coming in through a web-based channel or an email-based vector, but you also need to be able to cross-correlate so that you can tell what other victims were potentially being sent that same email link or similar email link. And that gives you a better situational awareness, as you mentioned, Erfan, of who is being attacked, for what purpose. Because I think that for our sophisticated customers, it's not just simply about stopping an attack as a one-off. It's actually being able to understand the bigger picture of what's actually happening. And they actually may not block initial attacks because they want to track back to who is the actual perpetrator. Is it a nation state acting against my utility, or is it just another, a random crimeware author? These are important things to know to understand the nature of the attack and how you should respond as a result.
Wonderful. So as you've all heard and seen, this type of technology is a disruptive technology, and the reason why it's disruptive is that in a very non-invasive way, they're able to identify the thought process and the plans of APTs and other types of hackers that Phil has talked about. And through this virtual machine, that's the disruptive element, that they're able to identify what these malicious type of attacks are about without developing a signature. And I think that's one of the things that if we take away from the presentation today is that as the technology and sophistication of the hackers is getting more and more developed, we need more and more cutting-edge type of technologies to deal with it and business processes. And you've seen an example of how such a disruptive technology can help, and then what kind of processes need to be put in place in an enterprise in order to fully benefit from a technology like that. So thank you again, Phil, and thank you to all the audience that was there today. As I mentioned, the webcast recording and presentation will be available in a couple of days to all of you. So enjoy reading that and sharing it with your colleagues and friends in the industry. If you need to reach Phil Lynn at FireEye, please send me an email. I'll be happy to forward it to him, and then he can work with you directly. And also on September 18th, which is a Tuesday, from 5 p.m. to 7:30 p.m., we're going to have a presentation and a seminar on business process security by Partha Datta Ray of Albedo. I'll be sending out announcements for that. If you are in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, we do these every month at IBM at the Innovation Center in Foster City, California. So with that, we have reached the bottom of the hour. Thanks again, Phil.
Thank you, Erfan.
And thank you to all, and have a good day. Bye-bye now. And the recording is going to end at this time.